Deepwater Horizon. Imagine working on an oil rig the size of a skyscraper lying flat on the ocean. That was the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. On April 20th, 2010, things went horribly wrong. A surge of natural gas shot up the drill pipe, igniting and causing a massive explosion that killed 11 workers and sent flames shooting into the sky. For 2 days, the rig burned before collapsing and sinking, but the true horror was just beginning. The blowout preventer, a device meant to stop leaks, failed. Crude oil gushed from the underwater well at a depth of over a mile, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Day after day, the oil kept coming, eventually spilling an estimated 210 million gallons into the Gulf over 87 days. The environmental impact was catastrophic. Beaches, once teeming with life, became oil-slicked wastelands. Dolphins and sea turtles washed ashore covered in black sludge. Coral reefs, already fragile, suffered devastating damage. And for the fishing communities along the Gulf Coast, livelihoods were destroyed overnight. BP, the company responsible, tried everything. Giant caps, containment domes, and even top kills. This is where mud is pumped in to stop the leak, but each failed attempt was like a bad punchline in an ongoing tragedy. The fallout didn't just stop with the cleanup. BP faced billions in fines, lawsuits, and years of scrutiny. The spill exposed serious flaws in safety measures and the oil industry's oversight. It forced people to ask hard questions about our dependence on fossil fuels and what we're willing to risk to keep using them. The disaster wasn't just a spill, it was a brutal reminder that one wrong move can lead to an environmental catastrophe of epic proportions. Even now, the scars of Deepwater Horizon linger beneath the waves and in the hearts of the communities affected. Rana Plaza. The Rana Plaza, located in Bangladesh, wasn't really the best example of engineering genius. Sohail Rana and his dad built the place, but let's say they weren't exactly the go-to guys for architectural know-how, unless you consider cutting corners a skill. Sohail originally had the building planned for commercial purposes, but he ended up turning it into a garment factory instead. And as it turns out, there were a few issues with this plan. Sohail totally went off the rails and slapped on 5 extra floors to the building without any permits or safety checks, like he was just playing a game of Jenga with people's lives. And those extra floors weren't just sitting there empty, they were filled with heavy sewing machines crammed with around 5,000 workers and precariously held up under a ticking time bomb of shoddy construction. So, on April 23rd, 2013, some engineers swung by to take a look at the building and noticed some pretty big, suspicious cracks in the wall. Anywhere else in the world, this would have raised a huge red flag, and folks would have been told to get out quicker than you can say unsafe. But here, the engineers sensed something was off and could only alert Sohail and the crew to evacuate. The following day, April 24th, Sohail Rana made a questionable choice, pulling a classic bad boss maneuver. Even though he was aware of the issues, he still told all his workers to come in like it was just another day. Unfortunately, disaster hit and the building just couldn't take the pressure. The cracks grew bigger, and in a disastrous instant, Rana Plaza came crashing down like a sandcastle swept away by the tide. The floors collapsed one after another, trapping thousands of workers beneath piles of debris. It wasn't just a collapse, it was a total failure of humanity and responsibility. You could hear the collapse ringing through Dhaka, and before long, rescue workers were hurrying to the scene, doing everything they could to save those stuck inside. Rescue efforts took a lot of time and care since more than 1,134 people sadly lost their lives and around 2,500 others were hurt. Sadly, a lot of workers lost their lives due to being crushed by the debris, and others faced suffocation from the dust and rubble. Some were saved later, but unfortunately, it was too late for many others. The shock of the collapse was felt not only in Bangladesh, but around the globe, leaving people wondering how something like this could occur in the 21st century. Love Canal. You know that saying, don't bury your problems? Well, the Love Canal disaster is a chilling example of what happens when you do. Picture this. In the 1940s and 1950s, the Hooker Chemical Company dumped around 21,000 tons of toxic waste into an abandoned canal in Niagara Falls, New York. Then they sold the land to the local school board for $1. Fast forward to the 1970s, and heavy rains began to seep through the soil, pushing the buried chemical cocktail up to the surface and into people's basements. Imagine living in a neighborhood where the air stung your eyes and burned your throat. That was daily life for residents. People noticed their gardens were dying, children developed skin rashes, and cancer rates were off the charts. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter declared a state of emergency, the first time a man-made disaster got that level of attention. The most gut-wrenching part was learning that hundreds of families families were living just steps away from this toxic stew. Birth defects, miscarriages, and a host of health issues plagued residents, but the companies responsible denied accountability, claiming there was no solid proof. Meanwhile, people were practically breathing poison. It wasn't just about leaking barrels, it was about corporate greed versus human lives. The Love Canal disaster became a symbol of how toxic waste can literally come back to haunt you. The public outrage led to landmark legislation like the creation of the Superfund program, which forces polluters to pay for the cleanup. But even with the cleanup efforts, the ghost of Love Canal still lingers. It makes you wonder, how many other places are ticking time bombs waiting to explode? The disaster showed us that sometimes the ground we walk on hides horrors that no one wants to talk about until it's too late. 3 Mile Island. So imagine March 28, 1979, when you started a regular day at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, but it quickly spiraled into America's worst nuclear accident. A minor malfunction in the secondary cooling system caused one of the reactors to overheat. A pressure valve got stuck open, and radioactive coolant began leaking out. Here's the kicker. Due to miscommunication, human error, and a touch of sheer panic, operators didn't realize the severity of what was happening until it was almost too late. Imagine being one of those operators flipping switches and reading gauges as alarms blared, knowing a nuclear meltdown could be imminent. Panic swept through the nearby community as conflicting reports emerged about the scale of the disaster. Was it minor? Was it Chernobyl waiting to happen? Pregnant women and children were advised to evacuate. The sight of parents scrambling to flee with their families in tow was surreal, like a dystopian movie scene come to life. The partial meltdown did release some radioactive gases, but thankfully the core didn't fully breach. However, the fear of what could have been was enough to shake public trust in nuclear power. The aftermath wasn't just a wake-up call for nuclear safety, it marked a beginning of a long, heated debate about the risks of nuclear energy in America. Ironically, the industry's safety record since then has been pretty solid, but the scar left by 3 Mile Island remains. It became a symbol of technological hubris, a reminder that even the most advanced systems can unravel due to something as simple as a stuck valve and human error. Flint Water Crisis. Flint, Michigan's water crisis, is a heartbreaking case of government neglect, and it all started with an attempt to save money. In 2014, Flint switched its water supply from the Detroit system to the Flint River, a decision that would cost lives. Residents complained immediately about the taste and color of their water, but officials dismissed their concerns. Turns out the Flint River water was so corrosive, it caused lead from old pipes to leach into the drinking water. Imagine turning on your faucet and watching brown, foul-smelling water flow out. Worse, residents, including children, were unknowingly ingesting lead, a substance that could permanently damage the brain and nervous system. The worst part? The government knew! Records later revealed that officials were aware of the lead levels and dismissed or even covered up findings that showed the water was unsafe. A local pediatrician, Dr. Mona Hana-Atisha, became a hero when she blew the whistle after finding alarming levels of lead in her patient's blood. Her data forced authorities to confront what they had denied for months. Imagine being a parent and realizing your child's development had been permanently compromised by the very people who were supposed to protect you. The Flint water crisis isn't just a story of toxic water, it's a story of systematic failures, environmental racism, and a community that refused to be silenced. Though the water has been treated and lead pipes are being replaced, the scars remain. Trust was shattered, and many families are still dealing with the health impacts today. The crisis made it clear. Clean water isn't a privilege, it's a right, and when people in power forget that, it's everyday citizens who suffer. Triangle Shirtwaist. Picture this. You're heading to your job in New York City, 1911, at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, completely unaware that your day is about to spiral into a nightmare straight out of a horror film. In this factory, you'd find thousands of women hard at work sewing, ironing, and putting together garments. It was just another day at work, going through the same routine of stitching fabrics into shirts. While they were busy working on the 8th and 9th floors of the factory, none of these women realized that it wasn't just fabric they would be trying to escape from, it was a deadly fire. So, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was located in a building that had fire escapes, but interestingly, only the top 2 floors were dedicated to the garment business, while the other floors were occupied by different businesses. So, the factory owners were dealing with some trust issues when it came to their workers. Turns out that a few of them were using the fire escapes to sneak out early or just dodge work altogether. The owners figured that to stop their workers from leaving, the smartest move was just to lock the exits. Yeah, they actually locked the doors that were meant to be an emergency exit. Now, let's jump ahead to March 25th, 1911. While the workers were busy inside, someone outside spotted smoke rising from the upper floors. Before long, flames began to engulf the factory where heaps of fabric, wooden bins, and other flammable stuff were just sitting there, ready to catch fire at the slightest spark. With the fire roaring, chaos broke out. Workers rushed to find their way out, but guess what? Those so-called fire escapes were locked up tighter than a jar of pickles your grandma swears you can open all by yourself. The workers found themselves with just a couple of ways to get out since they couldn't access the fire escapes. With so many people packed into the factory, those exits turned into real bottlenecks. People were shoving and pushing, trying to find their way to safety, but it was just way too crowded to handle. Some folks even attempted to squeeze into the building's lone elevator, but it totally got swamped by the crowd. As workers gasped for air, they rushed to the windows, but some were left with a horrifying decision: face the flames or take the leap. In a heart-wrenching situation, a lot of women made the desperate choice to jump from the 8th and 9th floors, clinging to the hope that somehow a miracle would come along to rescue them from the raging fire. As the fire blazed on, the fire trucks showed up, but their ladders couldn't quite make it to the 8th floor. The hoses were spraying water, but honestly, it was too late. The fire had already taken everything. Ultimately, 146 people lost their lives, with the majority being women. Some lost their lives to the flames, others due to smoke inhalation, and some tragically fell or jumped to escape. Bhopal Disaster. Let's travel back to 1984 when in the early hours of December 3rd, 1984, a poisonous cloud of methyl isocyanate gas leaked from a Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India. The gas spread quickly, seeping into homes as people slept. By morning, thousands were dead, men, women, and children, their eyes burned and lungs filled with fluid, and many fell dead as they fled. It was like a nightmare come to life. By some estimates, over 500,000 people were exposed, and to this day, the Bhopal disaster remains the world's worst industrial catastrophe. Union Carbide's plant was a ticking time bomb. Safety systems were broken or turned off, and cost-cutting measures left the plant woefully unprepared for such a leak. The horrors of that night extended far beyond the immediate deaths. Survivors suffered long-term health effects, blindness, respiratory issues, and birth defects in subsequent generations. What's worse, the contaminated site was never fully cleaned up, leaving toxins in the soil and water. It's as if the disaster never ended. It just stretched on and on. Justice, however, was elusive. The CEO of Union Carbide, Warren Anderson, was charged with manslaughter in India, but never stood trial. Victims received paltry compensation that barely covered their losses. The Bhopal disaster is a story of corporate greed, negligence, and the devastating cost of human life when profit comes before safety. It's a chilling reminder that the most vulnerable often pay the highest price when corners are cut and warnings go ignored. Chernobyl Disaster. It's April 26, 1986, and right in the middle of Soviet Ukraine, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant is having a regular safety test. So, it was just a test, a simple checkup, nothing to worry about, but it turns out that a regular test combined with a bit of incompetence, some poor planning, and a dash of bad luck is how you end up with the biggest nuclear disaster ever. So, the plan was pretty straightforward. They were checking if the plant could maintain power during a blackout. They had to turn off a few systems and check how the reactors would react. This is where the human touch really matters. Imagine a chef in the kitchen whipping up a cake. So, you've got all the ingredients ready to go, flour, eggs, butter, you know the drill. But instead of sticking to the recipe, you decide to wing it. You toss in a little of this, a sprinkle of that, and whoops, you totally forget to see if the oven's preheated just right, so now you're left with a burnt mess instead of a cake. So that's basically what went down here. The reactor really shouldn't have been running in that unstable condition during the test. So the operators, feeling the heat to wrap up the test on schedule and steer clear of any holdups, chose to skip the safety protocols and move forward. And the outcome? Imagine a sudden surge in reactor power. It's like flooring the gas pedal in a car and feeling that engine roar to life. Things didn't wrap up nicely. The reactor blew up, and when I say exploded, I really don't mean just a little pop. It was like a total disaster movie moment. A huge explosion that sent debris soaring into the sky, and it actually gets worse. When the explosion went off, it let out radioactive material into the air. Picture this. You pop open a bottle of soda a bit too quickly, and instead of the usual fizz, you're hit with a cloud of toxic gas that just spreads all over Europe. Crazy, right? It's not just about an explosion anymore. It's turned into a huge environmental crisis with this toxic cloud moving across borders. As it spread, folks didn't even notice just how much trouble they were in. What about the government? Well, they really took their time letting everyone know. Actually, it wasn't until they picked up on the radiation in places like Sweden that the Soviets finally came clean about things going really wrong. And you might be curious, what was the effect on people? Right after it happened, things were pretty rough, like really rough. 2 plant workers were killed instantly in the explosion, and sadly, within a few weeks, 29 more people lost their lives due to radiation poisoning. But the long-term effects turned out to be even worse. Thousands of people had to leave the nearby town of Pripyat, which turned into a ghost town overnight. People who didn't get evacuated ended up dealing with cancers, birth defects, and a bunch of other health problems that were linked to radiation exposure. And more, it took years and a whole lot of cash to sort out that mess. So they went ahead and built a huge concrete sarcophagus around the reactor to keep the radiation in check, but honestly, it was just a temporary solution. Today, there's still this 30-kilometer exclusion zone around Chernobyl. Fukushima Disaster. On March 11, 2011, Japan was rocked by one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded. Measuring a staggering 9.0 on the Richter scale, it triggered a massive tsunami that rushed towards the coastline. Within minutes, towering waves slammed into the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, flooding it and knocking out its power supply. What happened next felt like a slow-motion disaster unfolding in real time. With no electricity to cool the reactors, temperatures began to skyrocket, hydrogen gas buildup, leading to a series of explosions that blew the roofs off buildings and released radioactive materials into the air. Imagine the terror as engineers and first responders scrambled, risking lethal doses of radiation to bring things under control. Tens of thousands of people were evacuated from their homes, leaving behind everything. Ghost towns sprang up almost overnight, eerily silent except for the occasional robot used to measure radiation levels. The contamination spread through air, water, and soil. Radioactive iodine and cesium leaked into the Pacific Ocean, sparking fears about contaminated seafood. People around the world watched in shock, fearing another Chernobyl was unfolding before their eyes. Japan's government and the plant's operator TEPCO faced harsh criticism for their handling of the disaster. Many believed the warnings about the plant's vulnerability to tsunamis had been ignored for too long. The incident forced a global reckoning with nuclear energy. Several countries scaled back their programs or shut down reactors entirely. In Japan, the word Fukushima became synonymous with a crisis that revealed just how unprepared we can be in the face of nature's fury and the long-lasting scars that follow when technology fails us. Kursk Submarine. In August 2000, the Russian Navy Kursk Submarine was participating in a military exercise in the Barents Sea when disaster struck. An onboard torpedo malfunctioned and exploded, triggering a second larger blast that rocked the sub and sent it plunging to the seafloor. Of the 118 crew members on board, most died instantly, but incredibly, 23 survived the initial explosions and were left trapped in a dark, flooded compartment. With air running out and temperatures dropping to near freezing, they wrote farewell notes to their families. It was a race against time, and a race Russia would tragically lose. The Russian government's response to the disaster was slow and shrouded in secrecy. Initially, they refused international offers for help, claiming they could rescue the crew themselves. Days dragged on and hope for the survivors dimmed. When Norway and Britain were finally allowed to assist, it was too late. All 118 sailors were dead. The letters from the trapped men recovered later revealed the horror and bravery of their final hours, adding a gut-wrenching human element to the tragedy. The Kursk disaster shook Russia to its core and revealed serious issues within its military. Equipment failures, poor maintenance, and bureaucratic delays were blamed for the loss. For many Russians, the tragedy symbolized the end of an era and the need for change. The world mourned for the lost crew, but their legacy lives on as a stark reminder of the dangers faced by those who operate in the deep and the high cost of human error and institutional failures.